All right. So being an American lately stresses me out. Thought that was an appropriate sentiment for the 4th of July. I spent the 4th of July at my brother's house, seated around a table with 5 other people, 4 of whom were related to me. And no one present was interested much in fireworks or in red and white and blue. I think everyone present was kind of tired and fatigued and anxious and maybe angry at being embarrassed and ashamed even of this government that we want to celebrate leading a people on the 4th of July. I think we were wondering and sharing with each other, should we be celebrating anything at all this year? My 5-year-old nephew was displacing his aggression because my sister-in-law told him he could not just take the hose and squirt all of those of us in attendance. He then proceeded to tell his mom that he hated her and to tell me I was the worst uncle ever. So I am now the worst dad ever and the worst uncle ever. So I imagine at some point I'll be the worst grandfather ever and it'll be a trifecta. But I think his behavior is kind of symbolic in a way of the frustration the adults are feeling sitting around that table about the state of things this July 4th. On the drive home, I stopped at a grocery store to get fruit and oat milk and a couple of other things I needed at the house for the morning. The cashier was a young woman of color wearing a kamar or headscarf. I paid. She very earnestly wished me a happy 4th as I walked away. And I just felt overwhelmed with it again. How? What's so happy about it? How can you be happy? There are crazy people around here who want to deport you and spray paint things on your mosque, and you can smile at me and wish me a happy 4th of July, and I can't. Has anybody else been feeling like this at all lately? Because I'm finding it disturbing, and I found Martha Beck's talking about displaced aggression, really appropriate. I think a lot of us who are feeling our values may be trampled, those of us who don't want to put children in cages, those of us who don't want to close our borders to everyone, those of us who believe in science, those of us who want women to control their own health decisions and reproductive decisions, those of us who want to dismantle white supremacy, those of us who want to fight racism, those of us who want a clean environment, those of us who want to save the planet that's in a critical stage of climate crisis. I think all of us are feeling this sense of being overwhelmed with frustration and fear and anxiety and anger that virtually everything we feel is important is being shoved off to the side and ignored. And then this 4th of July, the President of the United States did something that broke decades of tradition by giving a speech on the 4th of July about American history of all things. And you really can't grasp it unless you hear the words, so I will read you a brief bit of it. In June of 1775, the Continental Congress created a unified army out of the revolutionary forces encamped around Boston and New York and named after the great George Washington, Commander-in-Chief. The Continental Army suffered a bitter winter of Valley Forge, found glory on the waters of the Delaware, and seized victory from Cornwallis at Yorktown. Our army manned the mumble, the ramparts. It took over the airports. It did everything it had to do, and at Fort McHenry, under the rocket's red glare, it had nothing but victory. And when dawn came, their star-spangled banner waved defiant. It doesn't get any better the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th time you hear it. Just hearing it, just reading it, I went through all the variety of emotions. Disbelief, how can anyone with so little knowledge of the country's history be president of the United States? And even without this ignorant man saying these ignorant things, there's something in me that isn't always psyched every year about celebrating a bunch of rich white English men liberating themselves from other rich white English men. The soaring rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence having its sheen tarnished by the author who penned "All men are created equal" being a man who held hundreds of people in bondage of slavery. The birth of a nation, midwifed into power by committing genocide against one race and enslaving another race to work the stolen land, every year seems not really worthy of the fireworks to me. Doesn't really seem worthy of the toast to America made with beer and wine over hamburgers and hot dogs. The entirety of American civil religion and its myths just no longer seem like a ritual I want to celebrate. As the prophet Amos said, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. And if you aren't familiar with that part, you probably are familiar with the next verse. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. What to do with the 4th of July for somebody who has my values, who thinks and feels like I do? Well, it occurred to me, and I say this with all sincerity, that Jesus could save me from it. I love saying that line to a bunch of Unitarian Universalists. You see, I know Jesus was not born on December 25th. I know virgins can't have babies. I know how unlikely it is that picking a star out of the multitudes to follow and stumbling along a little baby resting in a manger with a couple of really bewildered parents, some shepherds and angels, is highly unlikely. I know the manger thing was invented by St. Francis in the 13th century. I know if it was real, it was a cave outside the walls of the city. I know evergreen trees and holly berries are borrowed pagan rituals, as is the Yule log. And yet, the Prince of Peace is, I will argue to anyone, a core teacher of the way of truth and life. And the story of this person and the hope of the angel's message of peace on earth and goodwill toward all is indeed something worth striving for, and something I need. The symbolism of the Christmas message of peace being announced first to shepherds, and this is a really great symbol that a lot of us miss today. The shepherds were the lowest of low on the socioeconomic scale. You know, fast food workers, migrant farm workers. When the promise of peace and goodwill comes first to those people, that's a powerful story. That the promise of peace and goodwill and justice doesn't come to the high and mighty. And that's a story and a symbol that needs repeating and telling again and again. I can live with the inaccuracies of Christmas because I love the hope and the dream behind the story. And every year I think on the 4th of July, as much as I can't stand the American civil myth, I still believe in the ideal that drives the hope of the story. All people are created equal, with certain inalienable rights. Yes, even those people of color, Mr. Slaveholding Virginian. All people. I believe in the hope of that story that we, the people, eventually means all of us. That everyone is part of we, and no one is part of they. And every year, that's the tension I feel with the civic holiday. I feel a little overwhelmed. All right, I feel a lot overwhelmed with the way the hope of that ideal seems trampled in our current politics. All the while, those doing the trampling cover themselves in the sheep's clothing of patriotism. The sheer volume of the lying and the hate and the short-sightedness and the ignorance drags me down. It makes me angry. And anger itself is an exhausting emotion to have. We've been taught, as Buddha said, that what we are angry at will not defeat us. It is our anger itself that defeats us. And yes, sometimes anger is healthy. If you're angry enough, you're moved to act and change those things, right? But I think we've been living the last few years in almost a near constant state of anxiety turned into anger. Conservatives are angry at liberals. Liberals are angry at conservatives. And probably with good reason. And then we end up taking out that anxiety and aggression not on the things causing it, but on others. Sometimes on others who might be, let's say, by our side and on our side and helping to right wrong and make a change for the better. The reading this morning by Martha Beck gives examples of the misplaced aggression, taking out anger at one thing or person on another thing or person. And I think our current political climate's been creating an epidemic of this. We start taking our anger and anxiety out on each other. The anxiety and the anger roll downhill. And it rolls downhill on our loved ones, on our allies, on our friends. And then when we do that, we're not focusing that anger constructively on the white supremacists and the war hawks and the misogynists and the homophobes and the other mongers of hate and violence. In my life, I've seen this in my own family. My son just graduated from college a month ago, near the end of May. And I'm having a hard time with it. You would think that's something to celebrate, and it was that day. William Barber Jr. was his commencement speaker. That was way cool. I said, Zach, how come you didn't tell me William Barber Jr. was going to be your commencement speaker? He said, I didn't know who the guy was. And I said, Zachary, it's really awful to have to disown you on the day of your college graduation. But I've been under this strain, like I've got to really watch myself not becoming, that dad. That go get a job, you lousy bum dad. That I feel like I want to be. But it's not that I feel my son is a lousy bum. Quite the opposite. I'm just scared. I'm scared of the ever-increasing income inequality and the insurmountable student debt and the state of who's going to have health care and who's not. And that he's only 22. And oh my God, what's going to happen to him in the next 10, 20 years if we don't get busy and change some stuff. But it doesn't come out as that. It comes out as, Zach, how much did you spend, time today applying for jobs? That's not where it belongs, right? It belongs in constructive things on the other side. I know he's going to be okay. But where the anxiety and sense of overwhelmingness comes in gets picked at him. At my church, as a minister, I've seen exaggeration of some typical types of congregational anxiety since 2016. Our congregations, by and large, are filled with people who socially, culturally, politically occupy the center-left, way over to the left spectrum. You would think these groups as congregations would all have each other's backs. Yet I've noticed the displaced aggression. I'm wondering, and I think it's true, that those of us on that half of the spectrum are feeling a lack of control, a powerlessness. And so we look for the places in our lives where we can exercise control and power. So, if the place you can exercise control and power is not children being put in cages at the Mexican border, it's definitely going to be stopping the DRE from changing the middle school curriculum. Or it's definitely going to be controlling which copier the church purchases for the office. Or it's definitely going to be, I'm going to control what the theme of that stewardship campaign is, even though everyone else hates it but me. I've seen an increased amount of misplaced aggression directed at me over the last 3 years. Now, as ministers, you're a prime target for misplaced aggression. As our school teachers and counselors and parents, we know the drill, right? But it's definitely gone up the last couple years, way above average. To the point of, if I can't get rid of the president, I'll get rid of the minister. I'm serious, and I have colleagues who have felt this too, right? Later in her essay, Martha Beck offers suggestions for avoiding and minimizing displaced aggression. She says, first of all, be aware of rolling your stuff down the hill. Notice others doing it, and then try to be aware of yourself doing it. She says, remember the real enemy. She advises asking yourself 3 questions. What's really bothering me? And then, what's the worst thing about that? And then, what's the worst thing about that? And then repeat question 3 until you reach the real source of the stress. She reminds us to find our allies again. Others on your side and your wavelength. Apologize whenever you notice it for trickling down your stress and anger. There was a big conflict this year at the UU Ministers Association meeting before GA surrounding a new set of ethical guidelines for the ministry. And boy, we were taking it out on each other. If we couldn't control climate policy or immigration policy, we were damn sure going to get our own way on whatever we felt should be done with this new ethics. And it's work that needs to be done to protect ministers abusing authority and power over other employees, junior staff, directors of religious education, people who traditionally haven't had power, ministers of color, trans ministers, goes on. We need this reform. And yet somehow the bickering was all with each other about who wasn't agreeing with the right version of what we should do. It will settle down, but I just couldn't believe it. I got attacked. I lost my temper, attacked other people. It was awful. I think we're all affected by this in ways we don't see. But remember our allies. She says, mend relationships, expand our circle of advisors, ask for help, find different perspective, especially from those downhill of you. And she quotes Lao Tzu, who said, all streams flow to the sea because it is lower than they are. Humility gives it its power. Expanding on Martha Beck's suggestions, I encourage you to intentionally practice trickle-down tranquility instead. Connect. Intentionally create community wherever you can. Invite your neighbors to dinner. Get involved in something locally. Join a small group, especially maybe at church. I noticed in the last 3 years, the small group ministry at the church I was serving, I think became the locus for participants to process this trickling down anxiety and anger and frustration from the overall political, cultural climate. And remind them, among others who they connected with, of their core values and help sustain them to keep going on. Trickling down tranquility means being physically active. Whatever physical activity we can do, we need to do some of it. It's good for us. As the body goes, the soul follows. Keep ourselves healthy and breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. A brief centering exercise I frequently share with spiritual direction clients is to stop and connect to the world around you. Really intentionally ground yourself. And I will offer them a set of suggestions. Actually, touch the ground if you are able. If not, touch something touching the ground and ground your energy down through it. Go outside, even if it's the middle of winter, and take 3 deep breaths. Stop whatever you're doing or whatever stress you're feeling and name everything around you. Window, door, clock, person, chair, microphone. Name it all. Place yourself among wherever you are. Outside, tree, cloud, stop sign, automobile, flower. Pick up a pen or pencil or a crayon. Don't type. And write down as many of the things going through your jumbled, stressed out mind as you possibly can. Then stop and take 3 deep breaths. One of the ways we can practice trickle-down tranquility is to limit our information consumption. If you heard the news of the president's speech once, no matter how many times you hear it again, it's not going to change. I've tried to get myself into the habit of allowing myself to listen to the news on NPR while I kind of make breakfast and get ready. And then sometime once later in the day, whenever it is, to kind of scroll through the New York Times and the Boston Globe and stuff online. And that's it. Because I realized if I did more, I was just angry all the time. And that's what will defeat me. Take up or renew a spiritual practice. A spiritual practice is something you do with intention, depth, regularity, and consecration. Something that restores your sense of connection, calm, and creativity. Make art, any kind. Draw, paint, dance, sing, play the piano, whatever you do, make art. And if you feel that art is totally beyond you, and I recommend this seriously, get a set of colored pencils and a coloring book. They are not just for kids anymore. Pick one way to be an activist. I think all of us, if we could, would give every ounce of energy and every dime we had to all the causes dear to our heart. But none of us can get spread that thin. Pick something and be an activist to the level you can. In early 2017, I decided I would get myself elected to my town government in Milford, Massachusetts, and I did. And I've been an elected town meeting member since. That's my heavy involvement. To other things, I will sign stuff, I will give money, but that's where I'm putting the energy. Locally, my values are going to live locally, right where I am. Volunteer at anything. My favorite volunteering thing I've done the last couple years is during the summer in Milford, the Humanitarian Coalition runs a summer food program to replace the free school lunches and breakfasts. And so they need lots of activities, so I teach chess to children. It's awesome. I love it. Love chess, and I love that the children actually really love learning. I'm kind of surprised, actually. But it's a lot of fun. And guess what really goes down when I'm teaching chess with the kids? My blood pressure. It is as grounding as 3 deep breaths. When I was a kid, I loved after school to watch Kung Fu. Remember the old TV series Kung Fu with David Carradine as the Shaolin Buddhist monk from China wandering around the American West, right? Watched an episode the other day where he's a prisoner in this prison camp where they take drifters coming through town and force them to work in a gold mine. And of course, he gets involved in something trying to help somebody, and him and another prisoner get thrown in the oven. A tin shack that's left out in the heat of day, the heat box. No food, no water, heat by day. They're out in the western desert, cold by night. And while the other prisoner he's with screams and paces and sweats by day and shivers and grasps himself like this by night, Cain remains still in a seated meditating position. At one point, the other prisoner screams, "Don't you get hot or cold?" And Cain replies, "Of course I do." "But you're just sitting there." And Cain says, "Yes." And then he offers to teach the other man how to meditate and be still and endure the situation till he can make it better. He doesn't teach him how to not be hot or cold. He teaches him how to get through till he can take more action. What we need to overcome our difficulties is usually inside us for the most part. And we need to remember to use it. This isn't to say meditation and breathing, love and peace in and out, it's a magic cure-all. It's not. But rather, when we are overwhelmed, we must breathe and remember what activist Ralph Nader said, "We have more problems than we should tolerate and more solutions than we use." And I believe one of those solutions is us, right in and of ourselves. And one of the greatest weapons evil has is to overwhelm us and discourage us to the point that we no longer believe in ourselves or each other. Don't buy it. It's fake news.